Okay, well, I look forward to us having some time to, this is not the same talk, but it's just to start us off again with the, in the context of the conversation around a little bit more of a historical review with you about this notion of a therapeutic culture and what that's about and how we would come to, and I'll try to avoid kind of dodging in between those wires, how that we came to talk of such a thing, and sort of, and then, and again, we'll have discussion as we go along. No hesitation to ask questions, and we'll, if we get a little bit behind, especially now, we'll catch up at another date when we get a chance. Some would ask, are we in American culture particularly conditioned for this therapeutic culture? Freud, when he came, I don't know how many of you would know that Freud made one visit to the United States. He came to Clark University for, it was at one time, and I mean, it's a classic picture, if you ever happen to look it up online or something, of Freud, Jung. It's sort of many of the the premier figures that were brought together at one point in time at Clark University for conversations around psychoanalysis, psychotherapy. This was during the early part of the 20th century. And Freud commented at that time that he thought America was particularly conditioned and formed to be receptive to his work and receptive to some of his ideas. And I think that was borne out to be true in some ways. And in some ways that we don't even realize the degree to which, I mean, even from a language perspective, we talk about unconscious, we talk about, sometimes we'll even talk about language like some of the metapsychology of id, ego, superego. Even these kind of words have crept into our sort of normal parlance. So, but what's really more important for our conversation is the degree to which we were, I think, conditioned in some ways and for that receptivity due to some of our own history of being very individualistic. We're a land of dissenters. And again, some of these are broad strokes. It's not like every single person, but on the whole, if you watched the debates last night, which I bet a lot did, we know that everyone wants the notion we're all immigrants. And it is true. It is true. But the point of that we were immigrants and dissenters as a whole. And by that I mean religious dissenters, people who, for one reason or another, now clearly our history becomes more interesting and more complex over time with absolutely significant impacts from Catholicism, Judaism, and then a plurality of diverse traditions that would be represented now. But early on, if you sort of look for the thread that was there that would have formed the way the early settlers, etc., would have thought of themselves, there was a religious dissenting spirit in some way, and challenging the notion of a church, a state church, or even a hierarchical church. So the degree to which we were quite individualistic from the beginning, I think, is important for us in thinking about our receptivity to all this. And one point I want to make that's really important, I do want to avoid excessive implication of right and wrong, good and bad in this. It's not that simple. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that individualism is a bad thing, a good thing in its most straight, simplistic form. I really want to be careful about that. Nor am I saying, oh, dissenters were good things and others were bad things. It's not that simple. But we're telling a story. We want to look at the story together in order to understand our current context better. Okay? So I want to emphasize that so that we avoid that tendency. So thinking about the thread I want to, as we start to look at these notions of technological utopianism, elimination of suffering, and heightened consumerist expectations as part of the characteristics of this therapeutic culture, I want us thinking about that tradition that we have as being a land of dissenters, and the primacy of the degree to which we would challenge authority. We didn't like, some people, a good bit of recent work on some of the political theory and the American Revolution, etc., would have said that, to be frank with you, we didn't have a lot to complain about compared to some revolutionary context, that really in the American context, in the colonial era, that it wasn't that oppressive. Now, we could debate that, we could struggle with it, but I find that interesting, that there's been that a number of historians would be saying, really, we didn't have the same reasons some revolutionary context would have had for the, quote, rebellion, for the revolution. So what was it? What was it about the American context? I think it's interesting. George Marsden, who I would commend to you if you're interested in sort of religious history, etc., a number of books that he's written that I think quite thoughtful, but George uses the phrase land of dissenters and says that even when Christian commitments, and again talking about, because at that point in time primarily that was the primary religious representation, even when Christian commitments were strong, as for many of the heirs to the Puritans in New England, Christian and scientific Enlightenment beliefs were almost always seen not as contradictory but as complementary. So it's important to keep in mind that early on, during that era of sort of what would be thought of as the American Revolution, the founding era, the notions of the Enlightenment, with a capital E, and the scientific Enlightenment, was not considered really contrary to these dissenting religious commitments as a whole. Now, you'd find particular distinctions, but as a whole, there was a sense of complementarity rather than contradiction. And I think that's important to have in mind, that at the early front, the idea of science and the possibilities with it, the methods that were evolving in thinking about science during that sort of 18th century, early 19th century period were not contradictory, okay? That it's really a later era when we get into the whole conflicts with Darwinism and some of the modernist, fundamentalist debates, etc., that starts to take hold, and it has its own story, especially as we know here within the South. But early American story, important to have in mind that really this was not seen as contradictory, but more complementary in so many ways. I think even the phrase of when we think about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, I mean, that's a very, that's a phrase embedded within our history and our story. And I think that even connotes in ways that individualism and that presumption and assumption that of the expectations embedded within that, and the progressive spirit that was rooted in that in so many ways. I think when we look at this, I want to just I want to set that frame for us to be thinking together, as you would have if you had a chance to look at any of the Holofield or then the work by Cass and his committee, to see this sort of context in which psychology, as an example of a science, was received very warmly and embraced in a pretty profound way by what would be known as sort of mainline Protestantism, which would have been the most prevalent and the more and in that period of time, when I'm saying mainline, diversity within that mainline, but Protestantism versus Catholicism, Judaism, and other traditions that became more part of our story. Broad strokes going through history, because we want to have enough time to really focus a little bit more on our contemporary story as a manifestation of this. So we look at that out of that framework of sort of the early American story, and as we come into the sort of 19th century period, early 19th century, etc., one of the things that I want you to think about is the degree to which the church, within the Christian perspective, but other religious traditions, whether it would be whatever kind of religious formation and community might be, how it might be embodied, those communities became very interested in being scientific. It became increasingly important, if you were going to be legitimate in American culture, to be scientific. Right? I mean, if you're going to have authority, I mean, increasingly, in the 19th century, it became a question of, well, how can we maintain relevance within religious communities? And you may, and it depends on your tradition. I'm sure we have a great diversity represented. You may feel like, oh, you know, Keith, well, I mean, no, wait a minute, we didn't get any of that confusion going in my tradition. We were clear about these things. So forgive me if I'm sounding offended. But I'm talking big picture, as a whole, the religious communities in the 19th century and what I might call mainline Protestantism, which at that point was still the sort of, in some ways, for lack of a better, the power base of religious America in so many ways, was very captive to the idea of, well, if we're going to be relevant, if we're going to have a place in society, we need to be scientific. And what was the way to be scientific? How could religion be scientific? What would be a way religion could think of being scientific? Yes, ma'am.
Galileo said that, and he absolutely knew that the earth, in fact, revolved around the sun. And when he presented that, the Catholic Church threatened to imprison him, so he had to retract it. The Catholic Church has its awesome power back then.
So a pretty significant history of if you start to challenge science, right? So I mean that's an old. So think of a great example, and so move forward a few centuries and thinking about the 19th century, and if religious communities wanted to avoid that sort of irrelevance in some ways, what were they supposed to do? What might be a discipline that they could engage? What scientific discipline? Psychology. Exactly. That was the science. And it was across many sort of angles of engagement that religious communities said, oh, in order to stay in the game, in order to not end up being relegated to the sidelines, in order to not be found as lacking cultural authority, we've got to be scientific. How would we do that? Psychology. We will embrace psychology. Psychology and the degree to which in the early part of the 20th century then, the degree to which, and Hollifield chronicles this for us well, and especially in some of his even later chapters, the degree to which the sort of just the popular press of religious communities started to manufacture, I mean, whether it was around sex and psychology in the religious communities, whether it was around raising children, whether it was around good hygiene, the mental hygiene movement, profound movement. How many, I mean, after the Second World War, anybody with the VA or have relationships with the VA? Ever had the mental hygiene clinics? I mean, when I was in training, we still had the mental hygiene clinic. And, you know, at first I didn't think much about it. I just thought, well, that's just, you know, as a dumb young medical student and resident, I thought, I don't know where it came. And then I learned more of mental hygiene was a phrase that evolved in the early 20th century and very much related to religious communities. There was a lot of synergies and a lot of collaboration. Now they've caught, I'm just sentimental enough. I still kind of like the phrase mental hygiene clinics, and then they changed it all. It's mental health clinics now. The VA no longer has mental hygiene clinics. But when I first started training, we had the mental hygiene. Well, that movement was very much linked to religious communities, and very much was part of this embrace of psychology as a way of saying that we're going to maintain our relevance. This is how we will be scientific, along with the rest of the culture. And is that all bad? Is that all? There are parts in which I think, consistent to this day, there was significant engagement with psychology that has been to the benefit, in so many ways, of the care of persons within those communities. But we want to look at the bigger picture of how all this ended up sort of transpiring, and some of the implications for it. Philip Reef. Anybody know Triumph of the Therapeutic? That book? It's not an easy read, all in all, but if you're intrigued by this story at all that I'm sharing with you, if it's interesting to you, Reef is a secular sociologist. He comes out of the Jewish tradition, secular sociologist, not at all, not a religious person or theologically inclined at all, but an astute observer of society, an astute observer of culture. And Reef comments in Triumph of the Therapeutic, where faith once was, and this was written in 1966. So it was a bit, and so this and a couple more quotes I'm going to use from him. He always says men and man, so please forgive that. But men and women are offered art and or science. Modern culture is unique in having given birth to such elaborately argued anti-religions, all aiming to confirm us in our devastating illusions of individuality and freedom. This seduction that was occurring in some ways of psychology as the way to be scientific, the way to be modern, the way to really to be relevant in the ongoing cultural developments in American society, Reef is documenting. Reef is capturing, I think, in a very poignant way when he talks about the devastating illusions of individuality and freedom, the degree to which, I mean, do we prioritize anything much more than individuality and freedom? I mean, those are pretty important to us. Those are our story. We talk freedom. We talk individual choice. We talk, these are things that we're pretty familiar with. And to be frank with you, I think all in all, we don't think much about it. It's just who we are, right? I mean, we just assume that this is the natural, opportunity. Within this, and you might have seen some reference to this in Hollowfield if you had a chance, but the notion of the degree to which success became a primary paradigm of the good. I mean, to be successful. Now you might think, well, people have always wanted to be, but the degree to which success was seen as being linked to some of these notions of psychology became all the more important during some of this period of time. Success became related to a good personality, quote unquote, rather than building of character. You need to have a good personality. That's how you would be successful, versus building of character. And that may seem subtle, but it had significant implications. Significant implications for how we thought about and how we and the degree to which we expected others to engage. Harry Emerson Fosdick. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Going back to individuality.
Yes, sir.
If you're a member of society, individuality has certain boundaries.
Has certain boundaries. Mm-hmm.
So it has to be used and careful.
This gentleman is pointing out, if you're a member of society, that individuality has to have boundaries, and that's going to be an ongoing part of our conversation. That dynamic between individuality and community, right? That's going to come up over and over again for us. And I'm not saying there's some simple sort of formula for how to of where we come out on that. But that dynamic tension is an important tension, an ongoing one, and nicely pointed out. Yes, sir.
E.J. Dionne in Our Divided Political Heart, it has a very good picture of this over from the beginning of our country. It's a very well done book.
Yes. No. And there are and it's an important, dynamic and crucial, I think, sort of tension to be acknowledged and continually examined about as we think that. Yes, ma'am. And there are a number of good books for doing it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, Daniel Goldman wrote a book about 20 years ago called EQ versus IQ.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about success versus character, I know you know all about this. I'm very curious. They have emotional quotient, which has to do with your ability to socialize, have empathy, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's much more important in life than your IQ, like getting a doctorate from Vanderbilt University.
All right.
So some of the most brilliant and maybe CEOs of corporations that don't have EQ because they're actually not as happy as the people who have EQ.
And can be very limiting. Can be very limiting. And and I think what you're pointing out there is just the diversity of what we think of that we're going to. If you'll excuse my sort of using what you're describing there as an example of when you start to talk about happiness as what are the contributors? What are the real? What are the factors? What are we really talking about? What's the real good? The Harry Emerson Fosdick. How many know that name? Ever heard that name? Yeah, a lot. Okay, classic figure in American sort of American history. A crucial person, really, for setting the framework for this therapeutic culture. And you may say, well, but Keith, I mean, he was a minister. He couldn't have been that culturally important. No, I'm sorry. I mean, that's what was in. But see, that's part of the concern that was going on during this period of time. Was that the professional identity of pastors and ministers was seeming to shift. There was the fear of not having the same cultural cachet, cultural authority that had actually been there from the beginning and for many years. So, but Fosdick was in a period of time when he still had out of Riverside Church in New York, major figure, and Fosdick actually had some of his own story with regard to struggles with depression, etc., which were pretty profound. And coming out of that, I think it clearly influenced. Our own stories always influence us, right? I mean, they always do. Let's not kid ourselves. So, well, some of you may be perfectly objective, okay, but most of us are formed and interwoven with our ideas or with our own personal stories. And Fosdick would talk about that preaching. He would talk about that preaching should be good group counseling. He was very much an advocate for the notion of that counseling was central to the work of the pastor, the person in the ministerial role. So at that point in time, in that early 20th century, he still, at that point, coming out of Riverside in New York, he was a voice, a cultural voice of significant impact. And actually was served in that post-war period as a primary sort of collaborator in this development of this therapeutic culture that I'm talking about with you. The whole role of individual counseling, I think, was elevated by his leadership and his role as sort of an example for a lot of pastoral persons who were trying to find their professional identity within a culture where science, remember, science was becoming the authority. Science was, and again, I'm broad stroking this, but I think we all see it. And I mean, do you get the notion of when I talk about science becoming the authority rather than religion, rather than some sort of religion? Science and medicine is a particular form of that. It's just one form of it. It's just one form, but it is a particular form of authority within our lives. And the degree to which this was occurring and the broad social and societal trajectories that were in play, Fosdick was a primary example of a person who was saying, how are we going to engage this? What do we do? And his response in the role of psychology was central. Now, this next quote from Triumph of the Therapeutic, because of the language in it, I remind you, this is written by a secular Jew who was a premier sociologist. Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man is born to be pleased. Isn't that intriguing? Isn't that intriguing? That Reef was identifying this notion, and it's not, when he's talking about saved, I think those of us who may come from various traditions that, good hellfire damnation saved, okay, I don't know that Reef is saying that as much as the broad notion of religious notions of redemption and reconciliation. And that religious man is born to be redeemed, to be reconciled in some ways. Psychological man is born to be pleased. I think he was prophetic in so many ways. Now, can those be brought into some conversation that's more amenable to some reconciliation? I think we can have some of that conversation. But what I'm wanting to do today is draw out for you and help you get some sense of some of hopefully the vividness of the distinctions, so that then we can continue the conversation about how these relate together. The phrase has been made, liberation through insight. That there was, during this period of time, some of you may have been through an analytic process. When I say analytic, I mean a psychoanalytic type process at some point. Some of you may have had more exposure to that and to variable degrees. And the early ideas within the psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic communities was very much a notion of that this was an opportunity for liberation through insight, that the insight derived would be liberating in a variety of ways. And were there distortions in that at times? Absolutely. There are degrees to which that was presumed to be, I'm free to do whatever. No, I would propose to you that that's a distortion of at least Freud and some others, to know any notion of, I'm free to do whatever I please. No, that's absolutely not what Freud would have been saying. But yet I think that's the way it got sort of translated at times. But in a more constructive way, I think there are notions about liberation through insight with regards to liberation from that which would psychologically oppress and cause really lifelong struggles for many people, and the possibility of what that therapeutic process might do. And that's an example of where I'm wanting to say, while I'm critiquing some of this therapeutic culture and its implications, please do not lose track of the fact that I'm also at the same time saying, what a gift that some of that insight, that when done properly, the work and the psychotherapeutic possibilities, when done properly and within a context that's not excessively distorting in the way some of these things I'm talking about today, very redemptive, very free, and a real gift to many people. When we see this, though, about the psychological man is born to be pleased, I want you to be anticipating with me a reconsideration of the good, the desired ends and goals. It's going to be really important when we start to think about some of what Cass sets up for us, of what as a people, as a community of people and as well as individuals, when we start to think about this distinction between religious man and psychological man, persons, what are the implications of the psychological man is born to be pleased? What are the implications for the good in life? If that's how we're thinking, then what do we think of as the good, the ends, the good? What are our goals and desires? How does that start to change what we value most, what we see as the goods in our life together? And then the last quote, and not to hit you too much with Reef, but I do think he frames some of this nicely for us. Psychological man or woman, in his independence from all gods, can feel free to use all God terms. I imagine he or she will be a hedger against her own bets and user of any faith that lends itself to therapeutic use. Reef was in 1966. Reef was anticipating this potential to sort of, well, let's use religion and spiritual. I mean, don't worry about the details of particularities of faith commitment. How can we use it for? Whatever I need for my therapeutic goals, okay, and my ends as a psychological man or woman, where it is where I've determined the goods are to be pleased, that the good is to be pleased. Well, let me use this to achieve that. You see where it goes? You see how it starts to become, and I'll make a big jump here with you just to the notion of I think in some of the settings that we're all, or many of us are maybe in at this point in time, of where the notion becomes of, well, what do we need to do to make people want to come to our religious community? Spaghetti supper, bowling, and what should we do to please, right? How do we keep people happy, right? What do we need to do? Well, Reef is seeing this. Reef sees this coming. Okay. So when we, one last comment that I did want to make on this before we left, it was just the notion of, that I think is increasingly important for us to keep in mind, and you may have a good sense of this, or it may be, but is the increasing immanence of God. By that I mean the sort of internal notions of God, that God is, that the potential for healing is within the person. No external, no need, not a transcendent God. No need for a transcendent God. Let's just keep this within my own power and last week, control. Yes, my friend, my own power and control. Right. Let me keep this within in that some way, and that it's a subtle shift, but it starts to become, I think, all quite important. So then Marsden says again, then, as we start to think about all this, in light of John Dewey, know that name? Dewey, important name in American history. There are so many different names we could use, but I'm choosing just some figures to tell the story through. We had Fosdick, then we've got Dewey as an example of sort of functional pragmatism, but a major philosophical figure. And intriguingly enough, Dewey comes out of a very active religious background. I think actually somewhere I've read that he even came out of what would be called a, quote, evangelical background, as did Carl Rogers. A lot of these names that you hear, who clearly not hearing of them as religious figures, but they came out of traditions and were formed. And then during this period of time that we're talking about, they abandoned that because, I shouldn't say because, as part of the story of how do I be relevant? How do I be part of the authoritative society? Where do I go? Okay, Carl Rogers, he first went to New York to attend Union Seminary. Took some classes at Union Seminary, decided to go across the street to Columbia, and goes into education and psychology. Transitioned across the street to say, I want that. I want that authority. I want part of that story. Dewey, in light of modern science, Dewey continued with new religious beliefs ought to be constructed that more healthfully advance the human species. Think of the shift that's taken place. Rather than some notion of a religious communities forming in some way a vision for how there would be some notion of health or human flourishing within that. religious beliefs are to be constructed that are more healthfully advancing the human species. It's been flipped. How do we, modern science will now help us structure our new religious beliefs in service to the end of healthfully advancing the human species. That's a very different notion than what had been prior found. You see the shift? Important shift. Holofield has a quote from Pastoral Psychology, which is very much in 1957, where he's saying in Pastoral Psychology, it comes out of Princeton Theological Seminary, where it's where it's edited, etc. Whole segments of liberal religion have so reformulated themselves as to represent an integration of a cheapened psychiatry with a smooth, facile surface religion. Isn't that interesting? That's coming out of sort of a mainline. And so what we've got are folks who are very much invested in the therapeutic sort of pastoral process. I mean, remember with me, you know, Fosdick et al. have had major impact, and you've got significant now. I mean, we're past the era when you had the New York school and the Boston schools of early clinical pastoral education, those kind of things. I just had to skip some of that just for time's sake in details. We can go back to it if you want to. But we're past some of that, and what we're really looking at now is that that concerns are starting to arise within the theological and pastoral community of that what's happened, and I use this example I want you to look at this with me as an example of when both psychology, medicine, and religion are being distorted. Look, cheapened psychiatry, or cheapened psychiatry, psychology, and medicine, and a smooth, facile surface religion. I don't think that's being a compliment. I don't think that's what they're trying to say. So we've got here in 1957 already some questions arising of the distortions that are occurring at this intersection. That there are problems that are occurring. Yes, ma'am.
Who was this directed to at the time, or about?
This was in the context of sort of early, I mean, seminaries were starting to develop departments of pastoral psychology, pastoral care, this kind of thing.
But were there particular public ministers out there that would have exemplified what you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely, and there were a whole set of persons who part of this would have been critiquing, and I'm going to have one more quote from you. This would have been critiquing what was seen as, whoa, where have we gone?
It would help you put a face with this.
Well, this was actually, I don't know who wrote this in pastoral psychology, but what minister would have, this would have been coming from, I mean, someone like Fosdick. This would have been a critique flipping back towards someone like Fosdick. Okay? Some people would have been wanting to say that this is a cheapening. Okay? And let me just go to, this may help a little bit. The cheapening, this is a quote from, and I don't have but I can tell you who this was. This is a quote from Wayne Oates, who you might know that name, some might know that name. Wayne Oates would have been thought of as a very, and again, you know, it's all relative, and Jim can help me out. He would have been a liberal Baptist. Now, I don't know what liberal, you know, how does that all fit? But in his era, he would have been Wayne would absolutely have been thought of as a liberal Baptist, but yet Wayne is critiquing here the positive. He's critiquing the sort of some of the excesses that were happening with people like Fosdick, etc., who would have been positive thinkers, okay? Treated personality as a reflex mechanism subject to prudential ethics and wishful voluntarism. They ignored the self's internal contradictions. We're going to come back to this in a minute. They overlooked the necessity for people to accept their limitations. And I want you to underline that one with me. And they conceived of religion merely as a crutch to be used for narrowly personal benefits. Now, this is a critique from one of the godfathers of the pastoral counseling movement. Wayne Oates truly was. Those of you who would know would be. And sidebar story, and I'll just, to give you a window on not why I'm using this, because I think it's good, but why it's particularly important to me. Wayne's really why I do what I do today. Wayne was a pastoral theologian who was a full professor. I'm from Kentucky originally. I went back to Kentucky to medical school after I'd been at Vanderbilt. I needed to save some money. That tuition was still expensive, even back then for me. And so, so I went to Louisville, and Wayne was there and was so good to me as just a punk medical student who was wanting to talk about, theology. I just knew enough to be dangerous. And so, and Wayne was very gracious and really opened the door for me to start to think about the possibility of bringing these things together in ways that have been really part of my story. And I honor him as a very wise person, but who was able to negotiate the complexity of this area and truly was one of the godfathers of pastoral counseling, especially in relations to mental health. So, major figure, okay, and very thoughtful, well-grounded. And I guarantee you, Wayne knew psychiatric nosology and diagnosis. I probably could get in trouble for saying this, but I believe it with all he knew it as well as any psychiatrist there. He was very, very smart, very wise, and clinically astute. But he's also a premier theologian. So he had that combination in a very distinctive way. He taught at Union Seminary, he taught at a number of places. Anyway, in that frame, though, he's pointing out that the positive thinkers, these persons who have this smooth, facile religion, okay, and then, but we're also distorting and what was the phrase he used in psychiatry? Cheapened psychiatry. They were propagating a sort of cheapened medicine and psychology and psychiatry with a smooth, facile service religion. These people who were distorting these, what one short term for it was, in his version, would have been positive thing. They weren't addressing the self's internal contradictions, the complexities of the inner turmoils, etc. And when we talk about positive psychology a little bit, that'll be one, while there are certain strengths there, that's one, I think that is a legitimate critique that's still there to this day. Overlook the necessity for people to accept their limitations. One of the themes of what I'm wanting to challenge us to think about over our time together is, how do we think about human flourishing and the fullness of the possibilities and the hope that I believe is embodied within the notion of human flourishing, at the same time that we acknowledge the reality of our limitations, our vulnerability, and our frailties? I want to hold them together. I want both of those to be able to coexist. I was talking with one of our colleagues last week about how one can be sad and be thankful and have gratitude at the same. The juxtaposition of sadness and delight and joy and gratitude. Those limitations, I think we have to sort out and have to, and I would propose, are part of an optimal understanding of this relationship between religion and health. And then ultimately, though, conceived of religion merely as a crutch to be used for narrowly personal benefits. That's that pleased, right? The man or woman who wants to be pleased without any broader notion of commitments and not living out that dynamic tension of what it means to be an individual in a community. So I want to ask you, what is a good... Cass proposed these questions as important, and I think he's right on target. If we're in the current era we're in this... I'm sorry, was there a question?
Yeah.
Do you want me to go back?
Okay, so the part where it says, they conceive of religion merely as a crutch to be used for narrowly personal interests. When I read that, I think about Freud and future and illusion.
Oh, good.
And the whole idea of religion developed as a crutch for man to deal with the complexities of the life that they faced and the difficulties
That's
that
right.
they faced. So how would...
That's exactly what Freud would have thought.
Yeah.
That is, the colleague here is talking about Freud's book, Future of an Illusion, where Freud basically, it is his primary critique of religion. It's interesting, and within it, he talks about this very language. I think Wayne is sort of sidebar referencing that, of the use of religion as a crutch. And I would actually commend, I've taught from it many times through the years, I think it's worth reading. It's well written, it's very thoughtful. I think he's wrong. But I think he's really insightful. I think he has a lot of thoughtfulness within it. And I think it very much is this is a challenge to that. But see, I think where Freud was right was if one is captive to that type of religion, Freud's critique is going to nail you every time. If that's the religion that you are appealing to, and I think Wayne realized that, Freud's critique is right on target. Jan.
You keep saying Wayne.
Well, no, Holyfield quoted Wayne.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That's okay. I'm sorry. I didn't make that clear, Jan.
Holyfield was a Methodist bishop.
That's right. Holyfield quoted Wayne. This is out. The quote is out of Holyfield, and my fault for not being clear about that. But this is a quote from Wayne. He was quoting Wayne when he did. So thank you. Yes, Holyfield is a good Methodist. So I think Jan's wanting to hold up the Methodist here. So wanting to, and he's right on target. Holyfield is a significant Methodist figure. But does that fit the future? But I'm so glad you brought that up. It's a significant book and is very relevant. And we can talk more about that if you'd like to. But oh yes, sir, Norm.
I was going to say there's looking at the history of psychology and from the 60s when they started this, that the emphasis in the 60s, 70s, and even up to the 80s was of the destructive parts of religion. I remember reading hundreds of case studies all about you cured somebody by having them give up their destructive religious beliefs. And I never remember reading a case of a positive use of religion, not one, until about 20 years ago.
You're exactly right.
And now, in the last 10 years, there actually are divisions among the 50 divisions of APA about how to utilize religion, study it, and see it as positive, can be positive in therapy or just in psychology in general. And so there's been Freud started that.
But that pendulum swing you're talking about, that's exactly some of what we're trying to address because of the tendency, just like we've seen in life, or many of us have seen, when you've been over here, the pendulum can go to, I mean, my concern in that context are the degrees to which the people who have said to some degree or another, oh, let's use religion because it's good for your health in some way. In a categorical fashion, that has its own problems. Okay, so I think, but you're quite right. The timing's exactly right. And interestingly, and I'll come. Wayne would have been an example of someone who was part of that, trying to negotiate that story in a way that, and was central to some of that conversation. Jim, and then Mr. Yes.
I was going to say it started even earlier than the 60s. Wayne was my teacher in the 50s.
Oh, really?
57, 58, 59.
So you were at Southern?
Yes.
He did good work. But when would he have started at Southern? In the early 50s?
It would have been about 50.
Around 50? 52 or 3. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Last week he talked about how people that attend church live 7 to 10 years longer.
That's the most consistent. Now keep in mind, that's an association. We don't know why they might have longer lives, less mortality, but there is an association there. Yes, ma'am.
You may know Dr. Dale Matthews
Sure.
from Duke.
I do.
In the Faith Factor, his book of about 10 years ago, he states that, and there's some research behind that. But one thing we didn't have time to talk about regarding health, I think what they say, that one of the reasons people who go to church live longer is that they don't have risky behavior. They may not drink or smoke or engage in illicit sex. And the other big thing is that
Depends on what church. I think that's what they're... But we won't go there. I'm not going to ask them where they go, but I'm playing with you.
The other one, which I think goes to the sense of community, is that they not only have a sense of community, and neuroscientists say that we are hardwired to be we are social animals.
Social beings.
We have to have 7 to 10 social contacts a week to stay healthy.
I think, and we're going to be going towards some of that direction with regard to community. You're right. I'm going to, since you've brought him up, I'm going to use Dale as an example of one of the folks that I think has been a bit excessive in his claims about really. But he's an example of someone who said this causes that, and this is good for your health. And I think he just went a little too far at times. But he's still an honorable person who's trying to do good work. But I think he's an example of some of that. But your references are still appreciated and very important for us to be noting and relevant for the conversation. And especially when you start talking about the social contacts. We're going to keep talking about that. I think it's very relevant. So when we start to think about how to engage this conversation in our contemporary context, coming out of the broad strokes of history that we've just been looking at, what is a good life? See, one of the things, I'm going to challenge you that we have to think about what is a good life? What is a good community? We have to ponder that together. And I want us to be discerning about how we're going to have a lot of diversity about how we sort that out, but I'm going to challenge us, but we need to be thinking about it. We need to be struggling with, how do we answer that? And I want to say, everybody has notions about how they respond to that, but it's awfully important to think about what's the grounding of how you respond to that. You know, on one level, I want to challenge you first to just say, you know, kind of, I'm not going to ask for, but I'd love for you to think, what's my response to that? What is a good life? What is a good community?
When you're able to sleep through the night every day.
I agree with you on that. But no, I mean, those are, thank you. To be able to, very legitimate. And I'm happy to hear some ideas about what is a good life. Yes, ma'am.
Satisfying relationships.
Satisfying relationships. Other thoughts about what is it? Anybody else willing to? What's a good life? Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't that depend on the culture?
Okay. She said, doesn't that depend on the culture? You're pointing out that's what we want to sort of dig down, deconstruct it to. But I want, first we say, what is a good life? Now, he thinks sleep's important, okay? And then relationships, significant relationships. You know, I understand. But you're pointing out, well, some cultural context, that might not be quite as important as others. That's the kind of work we've got to do together. But we've got to do the work. Versus, and keep in mind, what are the implications then if a society has become captive to a therapeutic culture where, for using Reef, in a psychological man is to be pleased? What does that start to mean about a good life? What do we start to think of as the good life then? Now, I'm not saying that that's predominant here among those of us here this morning, but I think we've got to struggle with it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm jumping in the middle.
Oh, that's
but
okay.
in terms of a good life, I think that and being happy.
Okay, a good life. Okay, but no, wait a minute. I'm going to check. I want you to keep your thought because I'm going to come back to you. She just said, in terms of a good life, and being happy. That's what she's already given herself away, right? I mean, she said that being happy is part of it, and that's okay. But I just want to name. I want to. So keep going. Yes, ma'am.
All right. I wasn't saying that for me.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying is.
It's okay if you were. It's not bad. It's not a bad thing. We don't. Please understand. I'm not against happiness. Okay. I'm all for being happy. I want it too. I just want to be careful about it as the ultimate ends. But anyway, go ahead.
And I think in terms of what he's saying is, I think having a sense of fulfillment that you've somehow contributed to your society or to your community.
Contribution.
That your life has some meaning outside your own individual happiness.
Meaning. So meaning, purpose.
Integrate.
Integrate, a sense of being integrated. There was someone else, I thought.
Not about stuff.
Not about stuff. Oh, a non-consumerist among us. Okay, not about stuff. Good. These are yes, ma'am. Balance. Balance. Yes, ma'am. Being thankful. Yes, ma'am.
8 years ago, the American Psychiatric Association said that Americans right now, in spite of our prosperity and technological advances, are the most unhappy they've ever been in the history of humankind. You may have seen that research. And the number one issue, can you guess what it is? The number one cause of Americans being so depressed? These are all wonderful answers to symptoms. Can you guess what the number one answer was?
What was it?
Not knowing who we are.
Not knowing who we are, which is a version of not having a community, not being integrated, having too much stuff, because we start to. I'm going off here, so forgive me, but we start to define ourselves by stuff. We start to say, okay, and I think what you were pointing out, right, all of which detract from knowing who we are. How do we even know who we are in those contexts? And but you see how that becomes distorted by this therapeutic culture and the story that I'm sharing with you this morning. Yes, sir.
What strikes me as you talk about this is, what would you measure that by?
I think it's a great question. He's asking, what would you measure that by? The measurement question, which is intriguing to me. Some of the country, there is a movement internationally. There's places where they're trying to measure happiness and in the cultures, and it's another conversation. But
what is a good life?
the good, right? No, well, it's the same. I'm right with you. I think, but that's what we believe me. It's being attempted. Okay, the assumed necessity of measuring, please stay with that, because it's one we're going, because you can see where, if we're going to talk about science, right? The science of happiness, someone's going to have to measure it, aren't they? I guarantee you. And I'm going to show you a formula in a minute, in case you're wondering how to be happy. I've got a formula, okay? I've got a formula for you. I'm not going to say I believe it, but I've got a formula for you, which is very intriguing to me. It's the happiness formula. It's really interesting. Yeah, John.
But in everybody's definition of good life, I always hear undercurrent of legacy.
Legacy. Interesting. Well,
Would you repeat, please?
Yes, he said legacy. That in everyone's, he was proposing that in the context of everyone's descriptions of the good life, that legacy is part of it. That a legacy is part of it. How am I going to be remembered? And that actually will be relevant when we look at a lot of things with him. Yes, ma'am, in the back, and then up. And I know people wanted me to repeat. She was saying that many of these things occur after we get past Maslow's basic needs, and that's when these at a higher level. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't the legacy thing part of the feeling useful?
Purpose, yeah. Sense of, and that there's that. Another way of maybe saying, just to contribute a little bit of, that someone will remember my story. That someone will remember my story. And be able to tell the story. Positive. Well, I truthfully, Jan. I just hope. But hopefully, positively. Yes, ma'am.
Are there universal concepts of happiness or whatever? Is there something that goes across every culture?
I love your question. No, she asked, "Are there universal cultural concepts of happiness?" And there would be people who would say yes. And I want you to, and you may agree with them. And I understand what they're trying to get at, but then I think your earlier question pointed toward, but you wonder, will that hold up? Will
enough food to sustain you?
Well, that's sort of basic, isn't it? It's pretty basic. Back to Maslow, yes, that's right. So, but I want you to think, so think together about what is a good life, and then, but then keep that intention, that tension as we keep looking at this over the next few weeks. What is a good community? What is a good life? And what is a good community? Crucial questions to think about together, and important for them pondering together as we go on in looking toward how do we most optimally think about this relationship between religion and health. Jerry McKinney has said in the book To Relieve the Human Condition, the commitment to eliminate all suffering combined with an imperative to realize one's uniqueness leads to cultural expectations that medicine should eliminate whatever anyone might consider to be a burden of finitude, or to provide whatever anyone might require for one's natural fulfillment. Medicine cannot do that, right? We know that. Those of us who, Joyce is just laughing at the thought of medicine doing it, which she rightly should. But that illusion that is propagated by the therapeutic culture has distorted our work in health and medicine. And I think when religion and spirituality tries to become part of that story, it's joined in the distortion and becomes more the problem rather than the response. Now this again I shared with you last week, but this notion of the science of happiness. And I just want to quickly, it's a little longer than would fit in, and I don't want to bore you with too much of these kinds of readings, but Robert Bellah, who remembers Robert, Habits of the Heart? Do you remember that? I considered it a classic. About 20 years ago, maybe longer, but about 20 years ago, Habits of the Heart. I still think it's one of those sort of, it's the stories of people in America, and but I think it's a true classic. I want to read just a couple of paragraphs here out of Marsden that deal with the Bellah comments. Whether Americans are dominated by the success orientation of utilitarian individualism or by the fulfillment of expressive individualism, the society is remarkably individualistic and privatistic in its most modern style. Beliefs are considered to be private affairs, and most modern Americans have considerably less concern for the community at large than their small-town forebears. The modern Americans rather seek people of their own kind in lifestyle enclaves. And I'm not critiquing as much as naming, because many of us live in some form of those kinds of things. These features of modern American life have important implications for religion. In the modern popular view and dominant in mass media, values are determined subjectively on the basis of how they promote fulfillment of the self. Religion, accordingly, is seen as an entirely private affair. One poll revealed that 80% of Americans would agree that, quote, an individual should arrive at his or her own religious beliefs independent of any churches or synagogues. In Habits of the Heart, Robert Bellah's book, the authors reported an interview that they believed epitomizes much of the American religion. And some of you familiar with the book may know exactly the story I'm headed toward. The interviewee, named Sheila, said frankly that her religion was Sheilaism. Sheila described it in the following way. Quote, I believe in God. I'm not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church. My faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, just my own little voice. That's America. That's the development of this individualistic expressionism that has roots in the story that I've been sharing with you today in ways that I think are very complex, but I think it's part of the story of the therapeutic culture, and it's part of where we are now. Now, you wanted the happiness formula. This is out of Jonathan Haidt's book. You may have heard his name. He's out at NYU now. He's a psychologist. Well, I can't keep it. NYU or University of Virginia. He was at University of Virginia for years. He may have moved to NYU, but it's a recent move if he is. Jonathan Haidt, The Happiness Hypothesis. Very common book. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it's interesting. Okay, it is interesting, and it's not. When I say I'm not recommending it, it's not all wrong by any means. But I think we've got to read it carefully. And when we start to propose the happiness formula, that happiness is equal to S, which is I'll just tell you real quickly, the biological set point, plus C, which are the conditions of one's life, in essence the environment, plus V, which are the voluntary actions, sort of the choices one makes. It's simplistic, but it's intriguing to me that they wanted to have a formula. And this comes out of Marty Seligman at University of Pennsylvania, was sort of the main perpetrator of positive psychology in this regard. And are there some real merits to positive psychology? Some along the lines that Norm was just describing around the, yes, with regard to the fact that it's not as focused on pathology in some ways. But if you go back to that quote from Wayne Oates that Hollifield gave us, but does it, by its emphasis on the positive, miss the reality of human struggle, the realities of human limitations? Does it distort and give a naive optimism versus, one of the things I'm going to want to work with you over the next couple of weeks is optimism versus hope. I want hope. Optimism won't last, friends. I think I understand the word, and you might say, well, yes, optimism functionally can be good in ways, but I want to challenge us to think about the difference between optimism and hope. Yes, ma'am.
This Time magazine is about 8 or 9 years old.
Right. The Science of Happiness, right.
Yes, sir.
This book is a new book, though.
Well, the Time magazine article is very old, but
Right, it is.
Photo ident memory. So I remember on the first page, it actually starts talking about Dr. Seligman. He was at the American Psychiatric Association convention somewhere in the tropics, and he states that 1 out of 4 people are born optimistic. He says the other 3 of us can do what he calls reframed optimism.
Right.
But 1 out of 4 are born.
And that would be that would be the set point. He would be saying that their S is high. They have high S, so they don't have to worry about C and V as much, you know. But Marty Seligman's work, and again, I want to be real clear. I'm not saying it's all wrong by any means, not in any way. But I do want to challenge the naivete of a happiness formula. I want to say that it's more complex than that. And then, oh yes, sir. Oh, what they are? The S is the biological set point. That would be kind of what Ms. Judd was then just talking about as she would say 1 out of 4 are born that way. That, you know, they just have a set point. They have an optimistic set point, a high mood, a happy mood. C are conditions. Think about that as the external environment, just the conditions that one is in. And V would be voluntary activities, i.e., I'm paraphrasing some of this for you, but kind of choices we make about the activities we engage in. So the S plus the C plus the V would be the happiness formula quotient. Yes, sir?
Just to be a little picky,
That's okay.
this is not a formula, this is not a measurement,
No, not at all.
because you have some rule for specifying a number that's associated with whatever process you have. A number of S, a number for C. And I see this more as just a label. What are the components?
I couldn't agree more. I didn't call it, they called it a formula. No, I think you're quite, and see, and I think what you're pointing toward is the problem with, I mean, measurement of these issues, which gets back to what this gentleman was saying earlier. Very problematic to start to really claim measurement in any way that can be additively quantified and then said, oh, okay, and this equals happy. No, I mean, you're quite right. Thank you for the point. It's not being picky. But what I'm really wanting you to see is the yearning for science. The yearning for, that they want to call it a happiness formula and make it into an equation when you're quite right, it's not a legitimate equation. But that desire, it's not new though, right? We've talked about it being centuries old, okay? Because it makes it authoritative. And we're going to talk about it some more, but I really want you to struggle with the idea of, why do we want to make happiness scientific? Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do that? And think back to what is good and what is a good community. Yes, ma'am.
Are we looking for a quick
Oh, aren't we all? And okay, sidebar story, just real quickly. I know we're going to run. But I don't know if any of you saw the front of the New York Times. Oh, it was within the last week where they were describing this small, I think it was the front page actually, small town in Georgia where a physician was prescribing psychostimulants to children. And I'm not critiquing him. I was so sympathetic to some of what was, because, and I'm paraphrasing grossly here, but these were socioeconomically deprived children in a family that was struggling mightily. And the kids were in classrooms of 40 children, etc. Everything you could think of that life was a setup for them to be problematic. And this doc was choosing to say, and that rather than one child in the family had been diagnosed with ADHD and given psychostimulants, Ritalin, and Adderall, etc. And that child had done better. The parents, these were low-income folks that were struggling, etc. They came back to him and said, "You've made, he's new, we can live, he's doing better." And this doc had decided, I got to help this family. So he put all the kids on psychostimulants. Okay? Now, as a psychiatrist, it was painfully atrocious to me in ways. But yet I was sympathetic to, he is engaging in a process because he doesn't have any better, he's trying to do a quick fix because we've not been accountable and responsible in some ways to deal with a good life for those kids. And you see where I'm concerned in the community. But then, as we wrap up, this final quote out of Haidt's book on the happiness hypothesis, we just need some specific guidance, and this is his quote, from modern psychology about what to strive for. The theological side of me, which does exist, and I have to confess to you, says, what have we become when modern psychology tells us what to strive for and the good? Now, that doesn't mean modern psychology is irrelevant. I'm part of it. I believe there's substance. But if it is to tell us, to give us the guidance about what to strive for, what the good is, how we are to discern what a good community is, etc., God help us. So, are you, yes, ma'am.
But presumably in modern psychology, well, maybe not psychology, psychiatry probably. There's probably a definition of what's healthy.
Well, I think that would be a challenge and a struggle to. That would be part of the question. But see, I think really psychiatry and psychology, part of the question would have to be, and you're right on target to say, what would these disciplines understand health to be, and what are the distortions that might be embedded within that in considering what health would be, and is health the highest priority of human flourishing? Okay, and how we think about, and remember when I said, I want to propose to you that in one way or another we can think about, yes, even when we're dying, which we all will do, that human flourishing can be part of that. Yes, Dr. Hargrove.
I'm reminded of Freud's statement that after a psychoanalysis, one just joins the general unhappiness of the rest of people.
Yes, and Dr. Hargrove, you make me think of, and I'll leave you with, and this will convince all of you that I would never want to have psychotherapy with Keith. Of what I've told students for 20 years and more, and have shared with patients at times, is that my understanding of psychotherapy is to transform unbearable pain into livable disappointment. And you may want to say, I don't want your brand. But friends, livable disappointment's not all bad. And unbearable pain to livable disappointment, I think, is a worthwhile journey for us many times. And you've been great. Thank you. I'll see you next week.